Hello everyone. As Channy mentioned, my name's Tim Siers. I'm from Canberra, Australia. Has anyone been to Canberra in Australia? Right, as I expected. This is my first time in Baltimore. I got here yesterday morning, so if I start to sort of speak incoherently, then just shout out or something, because my internal system's not quite sure which time zone I'm in, I think. Excellent. So as you know, I'm from MasterDocs. It's a company I co-founded after working for many years developing digital solutions for learning, content management, and publishing content online. It was inside this digital agency, Oxide Interactive, where MasterDocs was born, and now the two companies have worked with many different government and non-government organisations. So what I'm here to talk to you about today is an exciting initiative that we've been working on with the Australian federal government, in particular the Department of Finance, to improve the efficiency and the process of creating annual reports and using those annual reports as a tool to promote transparency and accountability in government. So there's a lot more detail that I can go into today about this particular topic, but we only have a short space of time, so I'm just going to hone in on the collaboration in the authoring and editing process, and I guess how that sort of flows through to the final result and how we got there. So the Australian government is made up of 188 Commonwealth departments and agencies, and this number fluctuates a little bit as departments are merged and joined and renamed and ditched, and prime ministers come and go quite frequently. And in this project, we refer to these departments and agencies as entities. And each entity is required by law every year, as you'd expect, to produce an annual report. Has anyone here worked on an annual report before or contributed to one? Yeah, a few. I mean, if not an annual report, then I know that many of your organisations have reporting requirements in some sort of shape or form that you've had to contribute to. Now, I don't know what your particular experience of an annual report is, but those participants that we spoke to generally found the process to be quite stressful. And just to give you an idea of the level of anxiety that can cause, I met one guy. He looked like this, he's just a dashing young annual report writer, and after just one annual report, he ended up looking like this. He's trying to hide the pain, but we know it's there. So why is this experience so painful? You know, what is it about that? And, you know, let's start off by talking about that. Well, as we dove into this, I mean, this is one of the reasons why we found this particular project so interesting. And the reason was because producing an annual report, at least for the government across these entities, contained a huge collaboration problem, which was right up our alley. So it was an exercise, I guess, that was straining under this immense pressure of all of these old processes and way of doing things whilst trying to meet with these current day requirements. So let's look at that a little bit further. First of all, annual reports are on a tight schedule. Time is tight, and working on an annual report for those involved is often in addition to their regular kind of BAU, business as usual. And you know, it's not the sort of report that you can spend years perfecting, because you've kind of got to bash it out and then move on to doing some work so that you actually have something to talk about in the next year's annual report. They involve a lot of different people. You've got to wrangle content from different divisions and departments across the organisation. You've got to coordinate reviews and approvals. You know, content's got to move through all of these different people before it kind of moves on to the next one. And I guess that process, all this backwards and forwards, is a stressful process. You have reporting requirements. So in our particular case, there's legislation that says there's certain mandatory things that you must report on, understanding what they are, what format they should be in, how to present all of that. You know, that can be stressful if you're kind of new to the project. And then finally, coordinating multiple published outputs. So then you've got to actually publish the thing. So this may involve liaising with a design agency, perhaps working with your web team to get it converted to HTML, to go on your website, talking to the IT people to figure out how to get a change made to the website, and then finally, it's online. So perhaps, you know, this is your role, or you've had a role similar to this, or perhaps you've just contributed to this, or one little portion of it. But regardless, I'm sure that some of this pain resonates with you in some way. Working on a large number of pages with a large number of people to tight deadlines, meeting your reporting requirements is a tough journey, particularly if your coordination team is small. And this is what those teams in the Australian government were facing. All right, so let's unpack the challenge a little bit further. And what we're going to do is talk about collaborative authoring and find out, is collaborative authoring the solution to all of these problems? You know, was it the government's solution to all of their woes as well in annual report writing? Collaboration is a term that you've probably heard thrown around a lot these days. You can pretty much slap collaboration on the front of just about any tool. It's fair to say there's a collaborative tool for just about everything under the sun, and collaborative authoring is no different. What tools you need though, and how you use them, and even what collaboration looks like, will probably vary in each situation based on the size of the project and the number of people involved, you know. I guess what works for 2 people is going to be different for 20 people, 200, 2,000 people. So let's talk about what we needed for annual reports. First up, take this example. We've all used Google Docs, I'm sure, and this has plenty of collaborative features. We can leave comments, we've got real-time editing, we can sort of see what each other is doing. I can get together with a group of other users and we can collaborate on a document. However, if you've tried using Google Docs, say with hundreds of people across thousands of pages of content, then I'm sure you've hit some of its limitations. And this is not because Google doesn't understand what collaboration is. It is more that this particular tool lacks the ability to retain that oversight and kind of manage the project in a meaningful way. You can't really see how it's all going. Some annual reports were developed by email, by emailing Word documents around or checking them in and out of SharePoint. And again, this didn't provide the sort of visibility that was required to manage the process. And collaboration's hindered. We end up with all these little silos of content from all the different people. And then it's a job in itself trying to bring all of that back together. So this is my first point about collaborative authoring here, is that we needed was visibility. The second one leads me nicely into structure. And structure in many senses of the word I'm talking about here. So structured authoring, we've talked about structured data, and just some structure around how the process is managed. And so in the case of those Word documents which were being emailed around, you know, that's typically in the word processing, just vanilla kind of space, it's typically quite a very unstructured process. Anyone can kind of do whatever they want. And despite trying our best to perhaps lock it down, there's always that one person that sort of manages to find out how to get Comic Sans in there, even though we don't want it. On the other end, so if we look at it as a spectrum, I guess on the other end of the spectrum, we have structured tools, lots of things that we've been talking about today, you know, XML-based tools or tools that result in XML, I'd class as structured. And this is enforcing a schema, we're adding metadata, we're building rich meaning into the content. And there are many great benefits to that. We've talked about heaps of that already over the last 2 days. So structure in collaboration on annual reports was used, though, to take the focus away from presentation, how it will look, and put it back on the content. And it was mentioned yesterday, and we experienced this also, that, you know, there's some resistance in that way of thinking as well. Some authors really like to see the content laid out exactly as it will be on the screen. So the presentation and the meaning and structure of the content is sometimes hard to separate. However, getting presentation out of the way definitely provides a more collaborative environment. I think a nice way to wrap all of this together, nice and neatly, is a term that we call Agile authoring. And this takes inspiration from the principles of Agile software development and applies them to the authoring and editing process. What we do here is we stop thinking about online collaboration, online collaborative authoring as just moving a kind of a digital version of pieces of paper around from people, person to person, but instead we rethink the whole process and how it could work more effectively in an online digital environment. So what we do is we break documents up into nice small little parts that can all be worked on at the same time. This is adding that structure that I was talking about. And then each of those parts can be iteratively worked on by different individuals or teams. They can move through workflow independently, and even access can be controlled. individually as well. One of the benefits here is that we now have a much more granular measure of how the document is progressing, and that this is now giving us that visibility that I was talking about. So we can identify bottlenecks. You know, a person may have been away and hasn't contributed their content yet, and we know about that. We have visibility into managing the process. And this is all what's at the heart of Agile authoring. It's about making progress on all of those small parts often. For our annual reports, you know, we were still stuck on a much more waterfall approach to authoring. And this is what was missing in that previously much more highly unstructured system where it really was just a free-for-all. So by adopting some of these principles of Agile authoring in the process, we then had better oversight and structure, which benefited us later in, well, what I'm about to talk about in just a moment as well when it comes to publishing this content. So these are all key factors in a successful collaborative environment. Otherwise, there's just too many unknowns in the annual report process and lots of double handling, and the stress piles up like Harold had there. Okay, so let me show you what an Agile authoring approach to annual reports looks like. I'm going to switch over now to MasterDocs with an annual report loaded in here. So MasterDocs is a web-based tool. It just runs in your browser. You don't need any special plugins or software, so you can access it from wherever you are. The first thing that an entity saw in MasterDocs was this dashboard here, which shows in the center section under table of contents all the parts of their annual report. And this is the smaller parts that I'm talking about. In this case, it's kind of like the chapters or sections of the annual report, but we could certainly break it into even smaller parts if we wanted to as well, right down to individual headings. In this case, this is what was appropriate for this particular task. So we can see that in the center section there. And we also show a few other things. So on the side here, workflow delays. This is when particular pieces of content have been in the workflow over a threshold. And we can see that there, you know, the example I gave earlier about someone not contributing their content. So we're getting more visibility now into the process. And of course, latest comments as well for communication along the whole way. Cool, so all of these bits here, and this is just the dashboard, we haven't even looked at any content as part of this, is giving much more visibility. This is a huge time saver and addressing one of those challenges I mentioned before. Now on the other side, MasterDocs is, I would say, kind of at a midpoint between an unstructured authoring sort of process and a structured one. So it kind of borrows some concepts from either. It's definitely not an XML authoring tool, and it's not, you know, just Microsoft Word plus the internet. So let's dive into one of these sections. Here we're in the management of human resources section, and one of the main concepts is that we break the content up by heading. So every bit of content belongs under a heading, and we strictly enforce the heading hierarchy, which you can see visualized a little just kind of by the indenting over there on the left and the content which appears over here on the right. So heading hierarchy is a big factor. The second part is that when you're editing content, which you just do right here in the browser, typing on your keyboard, we've stripped away all the unnecessary formatting just to leave the essential components that are needed for adding some meaning to your content, and nothing that's presentational with some of these items up here that you'd sort of be used to from basic word processing if you're a user. Under the hood, all the content is stored as HTML, but this is handled invisibly to the user. Our authors were not technical in that sense, so they needed a tool that kind of took care of that, and they could again just focus on the content. The other one is annual reports have a lot of this tabular data, and I just wanted to mention this briefly. So here we have a table for employment by classification and gender. Again, it's a mandatory reporting requirement to have this information. It's quite large. So we have an Excel-style interface for editing this table where users can punch in the data straight in there or copy-paste it perhaps out of spreadsheets they already have. The beauty of this is that we capture this in a way that the machine understands, and I'm going to just show you the final result of doing that in just a moment. One real quick challenge that we did experience with this is that whilst the legislation sort of dictates what you must and must not do, it's not prescriptive necessarily in how it looks. So different entities have slightly different tables still reporting on the same thing. So in the interim, before all that could be standardized, we worked around that by the what becomes invisible row and column at the top and left-hand side there that has standard options for what the rows and columns are. So regardless of how the kind of rows and columns are ordered and structured, they can kind of mark up these tables, I guess, with what the data is. And again, that lets us know where the data is in the table. And lastly, we did pre-populate some of the annual reports as well with templated headings to give entities kind of a starting point to kind of fill in the blanks as well. But again, that wasn't prescriptive, so they could rename as necessary. Okey-doke. So why? This is the bridge here. Why do we care so much about structure and structured authoring? Why can't we just do however we want? You know, why do all these annual reports need to kind of be the same anyway? Sure, consistency is nice, but so what? Well, this brings me to the publishing step. In Australia, the annual reports are what's called tabled, which means they're presented to Parliament. And this means that reports have to be, typeset and sent off to a printer. And this is where they could certainly make use of a product like Typefi, or they engage design agencies. It's also a requirement that these be published in a web accessible format as well. So not just PDF, but they must also be put on their website as HTML. With a push towards digital publishing, the Department of Finance wanted to take this opportunity to promote transparency and accountability as well. And thus, the Transparency Portal was created. And this is live now, so accessible to the public. It's at transparency.gov.au, and I'll just give you a quick snapshot so you can see end-to-end how this all looks. Okay, so here we are on the Transparency Portal. It contains all of the annual reports. In this case, what's online at the moment is just the first 14 entities, I think, that were part of a pilot. And we can open them up and we can read an online version of the annual report, similar to, I guess, how they could do in the past. We did, however, because they're all going into one site, we did allow for some slight branding to be incorporated. That was very important to the entities, that they maintain some kind of individuality in the process. So that's in the form of fonts, colors, logo, and this kind of banner motif that is introduced for each one. And that, I guess, is because of the structured authoring, we can do that really easily. Because that hasn't been defined in the content itself, now we can just apply that for the web version as appropriate. Like I said, the HTML comes across from MasterDocs directly, so where before they used to have to engage an internal team or another vendor to create an online version of their publication, it now just comes straight across with a couple of clicks. And if I just use this one as an example for a moment, so here we are on a page about corporate governance. Again, because of that structure, the benefit that we get is we can now compare content to, say, the same piece of content across multiple years for that entity, or perhaps that piece of content in multiple different entities. So corporate governance here, say, compare between Department of Finance and the Australian Taxation Office, and when we do that, it brings up the corporate governance content in both of those annual reports. So if we're interested in comparing those two, we can do that really, really easily, or in future years when the Department of Finance has multiple annual reports, we can go back and see, well, how did this content change over time? And then the last bit backs onto that tabular data that I was showing you before, just a little taste test. So if we go over to Find Data here, we have a bunch of the different data sets which are included as mandatory reporting requirements in an annual report. Let's go into employment by classification and gender. We'll say show all. We'll choose Department of Finance again, and then I'll scroll down a little bit. We can see that data has been visualized here in a graph, and we can perhaps narrow it down to female, so we can see the different females at different levels of government. These are our public service kind of levels for Department of Finance. Let's say we'll go for this SES3 here. So we've just graphed this particular one. SES3 is an executive level, and then we'll compare that to Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. It's a little bit easier to see all at once on a slightly larger display, but we can see here that Department of Finance has 4 and Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade has 15 females at the SES level. Now that might be really interesting for an article that I'm writing, or I want to display that over time, and I can get that data out here, which is pulling it straight from the annual report. So lastly, there's a little button down here, View Original Data, Department of Finance. When I click that, it jumps me straight to where it got that bit of data from in the annual report. So the whole loop is closed. All right, so this is a big deal for a government, in my opinion, to provide this kind of tool to the public and invite this kind of transparency. And the Department of Finance made it possible, and I'm sure if this is sort of in a related field to, if you're in government, they'd be happy to talk to you more about it as well. So the future of the Transparency Portal is bright and it's growing. All the remaining entities of the 188 are coming online over the next year, which will provide even greater wealth of information and data. In time, it's also expected to include corporate plans so that a user can track the link between what was planned to happen and what actually did end up happening, comparing between the corporate plan and the annual report. Again, I think this is a groundbreaking level of transparency and something that I'm really proud to have been a part of. So as we approach the end of the conference, let me give you what you can perhaps take away from this case study, what maybe you might be able to try. So we looked at the challenges being faced, which were the tight schedule, coordinating lots of people, meeting reporting requirements, and publishing to multiple formats. We found that an online collaborative authoring tool to meet these needs had to increase visibility and provide structure to enable that effective management of the process. It not only addressed these challenges, but it allowed for a published output that took advantage of this digital content, making it easily interrogated thanks to this kind of more structured approach. So if you make this type of information available to the public and you're looking to promote transparency and accountability, then you can see how you collaborate during its production might be able to enable these types of outputs out the other end. So this may be the time to try an online collaborative authoring tool, but definitely match up your needs with the level of structure required and how that will suit your authors and your users in the end. Thank you very much for having me. I hope that using these tools is something that will be able to get you spending less time here and more time here, which is the dream. Thank you very much.